I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumray here again for JoBlo.com with another Good, Bad, and the Badass video edition, and this week we're taking a look at the career of Brad Pitt. If you told me a couple years ago that I'd be writing an article called The Good, the Bad, and the Badass about Brad Pitt, I would have thought you were crazy. After all, isn't he just a pretty boy? Well, no, there's a lot more to Brad Pitt than just his good looks, although I must admit, look at the guy. He's pretty damn good looking. If you look at Brad Pitt's career, you'll notice that he's a character actor par excellence and can be insanely badass when given the chance. Just look at Tyler Durden in Fight Club, Lieutenant Aldo Raine in Inglorious Basterds, and of course most recently Cliff Booth in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now, there are great actors and there are great movie stars. But great movie stars aren't always great actors and vice versa. For my money, Brad Pitt is both. Although many of us probably didn't always think this was true. The key to Pitt's early success was his extreme good looks, it can't be denied. And this was also the same thing that pigeonholed him for years as a romantic lead, and it was kind of painful watching him stumble through uninspired vehicles like Meet Joe Black and 7 Years in Tibet in the late 90s, where I think Hollywood was still trying to figure out what to do with him. They wanted to make him Robert Redford, but Brad Pitt had other things in mind. It's interesting if you look at his three breakout roles, which were arguably Thelma and Louise, Interview with the Vampire, and Legends of the Fall. All three of these movies played on his good looks, with him as this kind of long-haired dreamboat. But after those three movies, Pitt more or less just ditched that whole thing.
Simon says, everybody down on the floor.
Now, his efforts to break out weren't always successful. I'd say he was actually quite bad in The Devil's Own, where he mangled an Irish accent and definitely didn't hold up very well against Harrison Ford in a movie which I must admit wasn't that great to begin with. But he could be absolutely riveting at the same time when paired with the right director. Just look at his work with David Fincher in Seven and Terry Gilliam in 12 Monkeys. It was somewhere around the time that Pitt did Fight Club that everything kind of started to gel. For a long time after, he absolutely refused to take any parts that would play on his looks, preferring instead to do character stuff, such as his memorable turn as a pikey boxer in Snatch.
Push your back a little, concentrate. You look like a boxer.
It took a while for Pitt to really get comfortable taking on full-on leading man parts, but his work for directors like Steven Soderbergh and the Coen brothers seemed to instill him with a new sense of confidence, something he didn't have before. So he could go and make a movie like Burn After Reading, but then he could also go and make a studio movie like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and both would be successful. Right now, I'd say Pitt's probably about as good as it gets. Just look at his work in something like Babel or Inglorious Basterds. Even World War Z, which was a movie that I didn't particularly like, Brad Pitt's very good in. Also really liked him in Fury as a world-weary tank commander, and if you had told me 20 years ago that Brad Pitt would one day be playing a world-weary tank commander, I would have thought you were crazy. But he's actually great.
God damn it!
Now, in terms of his best performances, it really depends. Part of me thinks it's gotta be Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys, because that was the first movie where I could watch him as a character and not think, oh, this is Brad Pitt. He's outstanding in this film, but then again, there are a lot of tics going on and there are a lot of actorly tricks. Maybe anybody could have been good in 12 Monkeys. The same thing also kind of goes for Seven. He's terrific in Seven, but when you think of David Fincher's Seven, you don't really necessarily think of Brad Pitt. No, you think of the Grisly Murders and Morgan Freeman, and I'd argue that this is Freeman's movie.
Oh, God!
Fight Club is different. Most people will probably say that Fight Club is his best film, and I'm inclined to agree. Now, Fight Club is kind of an interesting movie to watch now, 20 years after the fact. No one could have anticipated the way society was going to go, and Tyler Durden meant something different back in 1999 than he does now. You can't hold this against the film, and it can't be denied that Brad Pitt was iconoclastic in part. Yet, part of me also thinks that Edward Norton was just as good as he was in Fight Club, and again, you got David Fincher there, and the star of a David Fincher movie is always David Fincher.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Inglorious Basterds is a pretty interesting one too, with him as Lieutenant Aldo Raine. But when you think of Inglorious Basterds, are you thinking of Brad Pitt? No, I would probably say that you're thinking of Christoph Waltz. Instead, the one that I think is really the greatest Brad Pitt role, and it's his most recent, is Cliff Booth in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Leonardo DiCaprio is probably every bit as good as Brad Pitt is in this movie, as Rick Dalton. Funny thing is, I think that Brad Pitt could have probably played Rick Dalton, not as well as Leonardo DiCaprio, but could have still more or less played the part. I don't think that Leonardo DiCaprio could have possibly played Cliff Booth. There's something about the fact that Pitt, at about 55, and he still looks great by the way, being a little bit weathered that makes the role have a little bit more gravitas. He looks like a leading man of the late 60s, like almost like a Steve McQueen type character, and I've never really seen him in that kind of part before. Cliff Booth really is a badass in the movie, and he doesn't have to act macho or really do much of anything. He just has this sense of menace about him that makes him a thrilling person to watch. Just look at that whole scene where he's on the Manson compound. That is bravura filmmaking, and Pitt is excellent in it. And of course, there's the amazing ending where he takes on the Manson family, which I think is something that's going to stick with Pitt until the day he dies. I mean, Brad Pitt, you're going to think of him now taking on the Manson family. I just think it's the way it's going to be. For a long time, he was Tyler Durden. Now, I'm kind of thinking he's Cliff Booth.
Yeah, it's about right.
When it gets to overrated films, this is pretty interesting. I never particularly liked Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, I understand why it's popular because Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie were arguably the most photogenic couple of all time, and watching them fall in love on screen has a certain cachet. Both of them are good here, but the movie itself, I think, is lousy. Doug Liman's a good director, but this is far from his best work, and it's really nothing more than a string of action scenes that are tied together by a one-joke premise. Basically, it's spy versus spy, but spy and spy are married. And even worse, it feels like nobody even bothered to come up with a proper ending to resolve things. There have been threats of sequels for years, but of course that's never going to happen now given the Pitt and Jolie divorce, but I really think it's a film that both need to leave behind for obvious reasons. It's not as good as people think it was, it made money, but it's really nobody's best work.
Come to dad.
When it gets to underrated movies, however, oh boy, does Brad Pitt ever have a few, and for me, no movie is more underrated than Andrew Dominik's The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. This is an elegiac western that was anything but the usual western shoot-'em-up that people seem to anticipate. I remember seeing this movie opening day in the AMC Forum Theatre in Montreal to a packed house, and I don't know what they were expecting. I think everybody thought it was going to be Tombstone and not this 3-hour quiet western, and oh man, have you ever been in a more uncomfortable screening? People were catcalling the screen and hated it. I was sitting there absolutely riveted, except for the fact that I was very annoyed by people not respecting art or appreciating this great film that they were seeing. I really think that The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is a classic, with that amazing score by Nick Cave and Warren Ellis, as well as Casey Affleck as Robert Ford. Pitt is really good in a very quiet part, a very quiet character part, and I think it's some of his best acting, even if I think Casey Affleck probably, for a good reason, stole a bit of the thunder coming out of this movie. Now, another movie that I think is underrated is another collaboration with Andrew Dominik, Killing Them Softly. Now, people hated Killing Them Softly maybe even more than they hated Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. This is another one that I went to see on opening night, and people were once again catcalling the screen. But now even critics seem to turn against them, which is confounding. It's a darkly humorous gangster tale, but that's not what people wanted, I guess. People seem to be expecting The Godfather, not this 90-minute crime comedy action movie. Pitt here is cast against type as a fixer who's been hired to eliminate the men responsible for knocking over a mob card game. Brad Pitt is great, and so is the rest of the cast, including Ben Mendelsohn in one of his first really juicy roles, Scoot McNairy, Ray Liotta, and of course, the late James Gandolfini. Now, if we're talking about most memorable scenes, part of me thinks that it's Cliff Booth taking on the Manson family, but I also think you have to acknowledge Tyler Durden here and his whole speech where he quotes the rules of Fight Club. I mean, what's the first rule of Fight Club? Everybody knows exactly what I'm thinking. I'm not even going to say it.
You do not talk about Fight Club.
Now, if we're talking about Brad Pitt's best movies, here would be my top 5. Number 5 would be The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, with an honorable mention for Snatch. Number 4 would probably be Inglorious Basterds. Number 3 would be Seven. Number 2 would be Fight Club. And number 1 would be Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I know that's going to drive people crazy, but I just think that's the way it is. 12 Monkeys would be on my top 5 list, but I don't think of it as a Brad Pitt movie. I think of it as a Terry Gilliam movie or a Bruce Willis movie. And if I was doing a top 5 Terry Gilliam list or a top 5 Bruce Willis list, it would be in there. Instead, it's a supporting role, so I'm looking at it as one of their movies and not one of Brad Pitt's, which is the only reason, really, it's not on this top 5. So despite being 55, Brad Pitt seems as youthful as ever, and certainly isn't slowing down with Ad Astra set to open in theaters in a couple weeks. The reviews out of Venice are calling this another winner, although it's prospects at the box office seem a little bit dubious, with people saying it's kind of like a Stanley Kubrick movie, which has never really been something to light the box office on fire, although I think that James Gray's Ad Astra is going to be just great. I really hope that Brad Pitt's career goes on, and I'd like to see him take on more juicy roles like he did in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The time is right for Brad Pitt to be a badass, and I think as he moves into his late 50s and early 60s, we'll be seeing more and more tough guy Brad Pitt roles. At least, I hope so. Until next time, however, this is Chris Bumby for JoBlo.com, and look at Brad Pitt. I mean, isn't he a badass? I think so, and you know what? I hope you all think so too.